Chapter 10, Part 2 of the Brotherhood of the Seven Kings. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Brotherhood of the Seven Kings by L.T. Meade and Robert Eustace. Chapter 10, The Doom, Part 2. Christmas Day went by quietly. In the morning we all attended service in the little church, and at night some guests arrived for the usual festivities. We passed a merry evening, but now and then I glanced with a certain apprehension at Miss Sherwood. She was in white, with holly berries in her belt and dark hair. She was certainly a very pretty girl, but the uneasiness plainly manifested in her watchful eyes and trembling lips marred her beauty. There was a want of quiet about her, too, which infected me uncomfortably. Suddenly I determined to ask for her confidence. What had the mysterious gypsy said to her? This was the night when, according to old tradition, the ghost of the herb woman appeared. If Miss Sherwood could relieve her mind before retiring to rest, it would be all the better for her. We were standing near each other, and as she stooped to pick up a bunch of berries which had fallen from her belt, I bent towards her. "You are troubled about something," I said. "Oh, I am a very silly girl," she replied. "Will you not tell me about it?" I continued. "I will respect your confidence, and give you my sympathy." "I ought not to encourage my nervous fears," she replied. "By the way, did Father tell you about the legend connected with this house?" "He did." "This is the night when the herb woman appears." "My dear child, you don't suppose that a spirit from the other world really comes back in that fashion? Dismiss it from your mind. There is nothing in it." "So you say," she answered, "but you never saw." She began to tremble, and raising her hand, brushed it across her eyes. "I feel a ghostly influence in the air," she said. "I know that something dreadful will happen tonight." "You think that because the fortune teller frightened you yesterday." She gave me a startled and wide-awake glance. "What do you mean?" "I judge from your face and manner. If you will take courage and unburden your mind, I may doubtless be able to dispel your fears." "But she told me what she did under the promise of secrecy. Dare I break my word?" "Under the circumstances, yes," I answered quickly. "Very well, I will tell you. I don't feel as if I could keep it to myself another moment, but you on your part must faithfully promise that it shall go no farther." "I will make the promise," I said. She looked me full in the face. "Come into the conservatory," she said. She took my hand and led me out of the long, low drawing room into a great conservatory at the farther end. It was lit with many Chinese lanterns, which gave a dim and yet bright effect. We went and stood under a large lemon tree, and Miss Sherwood took one of my hands in both her own. "I shall never forget that scene yesterday," she said. "I could scarcely see the face of the gypsy, but her great, brilliant eyes pierced the gloom, and the feel of her hand thrilled me when it touched mine. She asked me to kneel by her, and her voice was very full and deep and of great power, and it was not like that of an uneducated woman. She spoke very slowly, with a pause between each word. 'I pity you, for you are close to death,' she began. I felt myself quite incapable of replying, and she continued, 'Not your own death, nor even that of your father, but all the same you are very close to death. Death will soon touch you, and it will be cold and mysterious and awful, and try as you may, you cannot guard against it, for it will come from a very unlooked-for source, and be instant and swift in its work. Now ask me no more. Go.' 'But what about the fortunes of the two gentlemen who are waiting outside?' I said. 'I have told you the fortunes of those men,' she answered. 'Go.' She waved me away with her hand, and I went out. That is all, Mr. Head. I do not know what it means, but you can understand that to a nervous girl like me it has come as a shock." "I can, truly," I replied. "And now you must make up your mind not to think of it any more. The gypsy saw that you were nervous, and she thought she would heighten the impression by words of awful portent, which doubtless mean nothing at all." Rosalie tried to smile, and I think my words comforted her. She little guessed the battle I was having with my own heart. The unaccountable depression which had assailed me of late now gathered thick like a pall. Late that evening I went to Dufrayer's room. I had promised Miss Sherwood that I would not betray her confidence, but the words of the gypsy in the herb woman's hut kept returning to me again and again. "I pity you, for you are close to death. You cannot guard against it, for it will come from an unlooked-for source and be instant and swift in its work." "What is the matter?" said Dufrayer, glancing into my face. "I am depressed," I replied. "The ghostly legend belonging to this house is affecting me." He smiled. "And by the way," I added, "you are sleeping in the room where the murder was committed." He smiled again, and gave me a glance of amused commiseration. "Really, Head," he cried, "this sort of thing is unlike you. Surely old wives' fables ought not to give you a moment's serious thought. The fact that an unfortunate lad was murdered in this room cannot affect my nerves some 20 years afterwards. Do go to bed, my dear fellow. You need a long sleep." He bade me good night. I had no excuse to linger, and I left him. Just as I reached the door, he called after me, "Good night, old man. Sleep well." I turned and looked at him. He was standing by the window. His face was towards me, and he still wore that inscrutable smile which was one of his special characteristics. I left him. I little guessed. I retired to my room. My brain was on fire. It was impossible for me to rest. What was yesterday but a vague suspicion was now assuming the form of a certainty. Only one person could have uttered the words which Miss Sherwood had heard. Beyond doubt, Madame Koluchy had known of our proposed visit to Rokesby. Beyond doubt, she, in company with some gipsies, had joined our train, and when we arrived at Rokesby, she alighted there also. With her knowledge of the gipsies, an acquaintanceship with Mother Harriet would be easily made. To take refuge in her hut would be a likely contingency. Why had she done so? What mischief could she do to us from such a vantage point? Suddenly, like a vivid flash, the memory of the secret passage, which none of the inmates of the house could discover, returned to me. In all probability this passage was well known to Mother Harriet, for had not her mother committed the murder which had taken place in this very house, and did not the legend say that she had entered the house and quitted it again through the secret passage? I quickly made up my mind. I must act, and act at once. I would go straight to the hut. I would confront Madame. I would meet her alone. In open combat I had nothing to fear. Anything was better than this wearing and agonizing suspense. I waited in my room until the steps of the old rector retiring for the night were heard, and then went swiftly downstairs. I took the key of the hall door from its hook on the wall, opened it, locked it behind me, went to the stables, secured a lantern, and then began my ascent of Grey Tor. The night was clear and starlit. The moon had not yet risen, but the stars made sufficient light for me to see my way. After a little over an hour's hard walking, I reached the herb woman's hut. I thundered on the door with my stick, and in a minute the dame appeared. Suddenly I remembered that she was dumb, but she could hear. I spoke to her. "I have a word to say to the stranger who was here yesterday," I began. "Is she within? I must see her at once." The herb woman shook her head. "I do not believe you," I said. "Stand aside. I must search the hut." She stood aside, and I entered. There was no one else present. The hut was small. A glance showed me every corner. The herb woman's guest had departed. Without even apologizing for my abrupt intrusion, I quickly ran down the mountain, and as I did so, the queer rhyme which contained the key to the secret passage occurred to my memory. I had my memorandum book with me. I opened it now and read the words: "When the yew and star combine, draw it 20 cubits line. Wait until the saintly lips shall the belfry spire eclipse. Cubits 8 across the first, there shall lie the tomb accursed." Gibberish, doubtless, and yet gibberish with a possible meaning. I pondered over the enigmatical words. "There is a yew tree in the churchyard," I said to myself, "but the rest seems unfathomable." There was a short cut home through the churchyard. I resolved to take it. I went there and walked straight to the yew tree. "When the yew and star combine," I said, speaking aloud. "Surely there is only one star which remains immovable, the pole or north star." I looked up at the sky. The pole star was shining down upon me. I became excited and much interested. Moving about, I presently got the trunk of the old yew tree and the star in a line. Then I again examined my key. "Draw it 20 cubits line." 20 cubits meant 30 feet. I walked on in a straight line that distance, and then perceived in the moonlight, for the moon had now risen, that standing here and looking at the church spire, the lips of the stone carving of a saint just covered the spire itself from view. Surely the meaning of the second couplet was plain. Wait until the saintly lips shall the belfry spire eclipse. The third and last couplet ran as follows: Cubits 8 across the first, there shall lie the tomb accursed. My heart beating hard, I quickly measured 8 cubits, namely 12 feet, and then started back with a cry of horror, for I had come to a large vault which stood open. The entrance stone had been moved aside. Without an instant's hesitation I ran down some steps. The tomb was a large one, and was quite empty. Never coffin of man had lain here, but a passage wound away to the left, a tortuous passage, down which I quickly walked. My lantern threw light on the ghastly place, and the air was sufficiently good to prevent the candle going out. Why was the tomb open? What was happening? Fear itself seemed to walk by my side. Never before had I so felt its ghastly presence. I hurried my steps, and soon perceived a dim light at the farther end. The next instant I had entered the hall of the old house. I had done so through a panel which had been slipped aside. Had anyone gone in before me? If so, who? Who had opened the tomb? Who had traversed the passage? Who had gone into the house by this fearful and long-closed door? I was just about to rush upstairs, when a piercing scream fell on my ears. It came from just above me. With 2 or 3 bounds I cleared the stairs, and the next instant my eyes fell upon a huddled-up heap on the landing. I bent over it. It was Rosalie. Her features were twitching in a horrible manner, and her dilated eyes stared at me without any recognition. Her lips were murmuring, "Catch her! Catch her!" The next moment the rector appeared, hurrying down the passage in his dressing gown. "What is wrong?" he cried. "What has happened?" The girl clung to my arm, and now sent up scream after scream. The entire house was aroused, and the servants with scared faces came running to the spot. Rosalie's terror now found vent in fresh words. "The herb woman," she sobbed. "The ghost of the herb woman. I heard a noise and ran on to the landing. I met her. She was coming from Mr. Dufrayer's room. She was making straight for yours, Mr. Head. Suddenly she saw me, uttered a cry and flew downstairs. Oh, catch her! The ghost! The ghost!" "Did you say the woman was coming from Dufrayer's room?" I asked. A sudden, maddening fear clutched at my heart. Where was Dufrayer? Surely he must have heard this uproar. I went to his room, opened the door, and dashed in. Inside, all was darkness. "Wake up!" I said to him. "Something dreadful has happened. Did you not hear Rosalie scream? Wake up!" There was no answer. I returned to the landing to fetch a light. The rector now accompanied me into the room. We both went up to the silent figure in the bed. I bent over him and shook him by the shoulder. Still he did not stir. I bent lower and observed on his neck, just behind the ear, a slight mark, the mark which a hypodermic syringe would make. Good God! What had happened? "You are close to death. You cannot guard against it, try as you may, for it will come from an unlooked-for source and be instant and swift in its work." The words echoed mockingly in my ears. I flung down the bedclothes, and in an excess of agony laid my hand on the heart of the man I loved best on earth. He was dead. I staggered back, faint and giddy, against the bedpost. "See," I said to the old clergyman, "her work, the fiend. She has been in this house. She has entered by the secret passage. Come at once, there is not an instant to lose. As there is a God in heaven, she shall pay the price for this crime." Sherwood gazed at me as if he thought me bereft of my senses. He could not believe that Dufrayer was really dead. I pointed to the small wound, and asked him to feel where the heart no longer beat. "But who has done it?" he said. "What fiend do you allude to?" "Madame Colucci. Let us follow her." I rushed from the room and downstairs. The panel in the wall had been slammed to, but my memory could not play me false. I knew its position. I found what had been so long searched for in vain, touched a spring and opened it. Sherwood and I hurried down the winding passage. Just at the entrance to the tomb we came upon a gipsy woman's bonnet and cloak. They had been dropped there, doubtless, by Madame when she had flown after committing her deadly work. We entered the empty tomb. On the floor lay a small hypodermic syringe. I picked it up. It was broken. To its sides clung a whitish-grey substance. I guessed what it afterwards proved to be, trinitrin or nitroglycerin in strong solution. The effect of such a terrible poison would be instantaneous. Sherwood and I returned to the house. The place was in an uproar of excitement. The local police were called in. I told my strange tale and my strong suspicions, to which they listened with breathless interest. Rosalie was very ill, going from one strong hysterical fit into another. The doctor was summoned to attend her. The fact of Dufrayer's death was carefully kept from the sick girl. Her father was so distracted about her that he could give no attention to anyone else. Meanwhile I was alone, utterly alone, with my anguish and horror. The friend of my life had fallen by the hand of Madame Koluchy. A fire was burning in my brain, which grew hotter each instant. Never was a man more pursued with a deadly thirst for vengeance. The thought that Madame was moment by moment putting a greater distance between herself and me drove me mad. Towards morning I could stand inaction no longer, and determined to walk to the station. When I got there I learned that no train left before 9 o'clock. This was more than I could bear. My restlessness increased. The junction which connected with the main line was a distance of 15 miles off. There was no carriage to be obtained. Nevertheless, I resolved to walk the distance. I had overestimated my own strength. I was already faint and giddy. The shock had told on me more than I dared to own. I had not gone half the distance before I was seized with a queer giddiness. My eyes grew dim. The earth seemed to reel away from me. I staggered forward a few steps, and then all was lost in darkness. I must have stumbled and fallen by the wayside, and my fit of unconsciousness must have been long, for when I came to myself, the sun was high in the heavens. A rough-looking man, dressed as a workman, was bending over me. "You have been real bad," he said, the moment my eyes met his. "The lady said to throw cold water on you and you'd be better." The man's words roused me as no ordinary restorative could do. I sat up, and the next moment had tottered to my feet. "The lady?" I said. "Did you mention a lady? What lady?" "A tall lady," was the reply. "A stranger in these parts. She was bending over you when I come along. She had black eyes, and I thought she was giving you something to bring you round. When she saw me, she said, 'You dash cold water over him and he'll come to.'" "But where is the lady now?" I gasped. "There, by yonder hill, just going over the brow, don't you see?" "I do, and I know who she is. I must overtake her. Good-bye, my man. I am all right." So I was. The sudden stimulus had renewed my faltering strength. I recognized that figure. With that grace, inimitable and perfect, which never at any moment deserted it, it was moving from my view. Yes, I knew it. Madame Koluchy had doubtless found me by the wayside, and had meant to complete the work which she had begun last night. Had she still possessed her syringe, I should now have been a dead man. Where was she going? Doubtless to catch the very train to which I was hurrying. If so, we should meet almost immediately. I hurried forward. Once again I caught sight of the figure in the far distance. I could not get up to it, and suddenly I felt that I did not want to. I should meet her in London to-night. That was my thought of thoughts. As I approached the great junction, I heard the whistle of a coming train. It was the express. It dashed into the station just as I reached it. I was barely in time. Without waiting for a ticket, I stumbled almost in a fainting condition into the first carriage I could reach. The train moved on. I felt a sudden sense of satisfaction. Madame Koluchy was also on board. How that awful journey was passed is difficult for me to remember. Beyond the thought of thoughts that Madame and I were rushing to London by the same train, that we should beyond doubt meet soon, I had little feeling of any sort. Her hour was close at hand. My hour of vengeance was nigh. At the first junction I handed 2 telegrams to a porter and desired him to send them off immediately. They were to Tyler and Ford. When between 8 and 9 o'clock that night we reached Euston, the detectives were waiting for me. "Madame Koluchy is in the train," I said to them. "You can apprehend her if you are quick. There is not an instant to lose." The men, in wild excitement, began to search along the platform. I followed them. Surely Madame could not have already escaped. She had not the faintest idea that I was in the train. She would take things leisurely when she reached Euston. So I had hoped, but my hopes were falsified. Nowhere could we get even a glimpse of the face for which we sought. "Never mind," said Ford. "I also have news, and I believe that our success is near. We will go straight to her house. I learned not an hour ago that a fresh staff of servants had been secured, and the house is brightly lit up. Our detectives who surround the place are under the impression that she will be in her old quarters to-night. I have a carriage in waiting. We will start immediately." Without a word I entered it, and we drove off. We made no plans beyond the intention in each man's breast that Madame should be taken, either alive or dead. As the carriage drew up at the house, I noticed that the hall was brilliantly lighted. The moment Ford touched the bell, a flunkey threw the door open, as if he were waiting for us. "My mistress is in her laboratory," was his reply to our inquiries. "She has just returned after a journey. I think she expects you, gentlemen. Will you go to her there? You know the way." We rapidly crossed the hall and began to descend the stone steps. As we did so, the muffled hum of machinery in rapid motion fell on our ears. Just as we reached the laboratory door, Ford, who had been leading the way, stopped and turned around. His face was very pale, but he spoke firmly and quietly. "There is not the least doubt," he said in a semi-whisper, "that we are going into great danger. Madame would not receive us like this if she had not made a plan for our destruction, which only she could devise. It is impossible to tell what may happen. That it will be a terrible encounter and that it will need all our strength and presence of mind is certain, for we are now about to enter the very sanctuary of her fiendish arts and appliances. I will go first. The moment I see her I shall cover her, and if she stirs, will shoot her dead on the spot." He turned the handle of the door, and we slipped silently into the laboratory. It was like entering a furnace. The heat was stifling. A single incandescent burner shed a subdued light over the place, revealing the outline of the stone roof and dim recesses in the walls. At the farther end stood Madame. As we entered, she turned slowly and faced us. Her face was quiet, her lips closed, her eyes alone expressed emotion. "Hands up, or I fire!" rang up from Ford, who stepped forward and immediately covered her with his revolver. She instantly obeyed, raising both her arms. Her eyes now met mine, and the faintest of smiles played round her lips. The next instant, as if wrenched from his grasp by some unseen power, the weapon leapt from Ford's hands and dashed itself with terrific force against the poles of an enormous electromagnet beside him. Every loose piece of iron started and sprang towards it with a deafening crash. Madame must have made the current by pressing a key in the floor with her foot. For a moment we stood rooted to the spot, thunderstruck by the sudden and unforeseen method by which we had been disarmed. Madame Koluchy still continued to gaze at us, but now her smile grew broader, and soon it rang out in a scornful laugh. "It is my turn to dictate terms," she said in a steady, even voice. "Advance one step towards me, and we die together. Norman Head, this is your supposed hour of victory, but know that you will never take me either alive or dead." As she spoke, her hand moved to a small lever on the bench beside her. She drew herself up to her full, majestic height, and stood rigid as a figure carved in marble. I glanced at Ford. His lips were firmly compressed. Drops of sweat gleamed upon his face. He began to breathe quickly through distended nostrils. Then, with a sudden spring, he bounded forward, and simultaneously there leapt up, straight before our eyes, what seemed like one huge sheet of white flame. So fearfully bright and dazzling was it that it struck us like a blow, and Tyler and I fell. We were blinded by a heat that seemed to sear our very eyeballs. The next moment all was darkness. When I came to myself, a cool draught of air was blowing upon my face, and Tyler's voice sounded in my ears. I rose, staggering. Before my eyes there still seemed to dance 1,000 sparks and whirling wheels of fire. The servants were running about wildly, and one of the men had brought a lamp from the hall. It lit up the wild and haggard face of my companion. "We dare not go back," he whispered, pointing to the laboratory door, trembling and almost gibbering as he did so. "But what has happened?" I said. I made a rush towards the laboratory. 2 of the men held me back forcibly. "It is not safe, sir," one of them said. "The room within is a furnace. You would die if you entered." By main force I was kept from rushing to my own destruction. It was an hour later when we entered. Even then the heat was almost past bearing. Slowly and cautiously Tyler and I approached the spot where we had last seen Madame Koluchy. Upon the stone flags lay the body of the detective, so terribly burnt as to be almost unrecognizable, and a few yards farther was the mouth of a big hole, from which still radiated a fierce heat. By degrees it cooled sufficiently to allow us to examine it. It was about 8 feet deep and circular in shape. From its walls jutted innumerable jets. Their use was evident to me at once, for upon the floor beside us stood an enormous iron cylinder, such as are used for compressed gases. These had presumably been used before to create by means of the jets one vast oxyhydrogen flame to give the intensest heat known, a heat computed by scientists at the enormous temperature of 2,400 degrees centigrade. It was evident what had happened. As Ford sprang forward, Madame must have released the iron trap and descended through a column of this fearful flame, not only causing instantaneous death, but simultaneously also an absolute annihilation. At the bottom of the well lay a small heap of smouldering ashes. These were all the earthly remains of the brain that had conceived and the body that had executed some of the most malignant designs against mankind that the history of the world has ever shown. End of Chapter 10. End of the Brotherhood of the Seven Kings.